Hello and welcome to Thinkpodpowered by the FII Institute. For more than 30 years, I led Sky News' coverage of global events, holding to account the politicians and change makers shaping the world of today. In this series, filmed at the 6th Future Investment Initiative in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, I've got the opportunity to question those shaping the future. At this inflection point in our history, how can we ensure that the future is one of prosperity and opportunity for all? This episode, we speak to Amanda Pullinger, investor turned advocate and chief executive of 100 Women in Finance.
If we're going to change the demographics of the industry, we have to start by changing the perception of what an expert looks like.
Finance is historically male-dominated, with few women ascending to senior leadership roles. Amanda's network of extraordinary women and men is forging a new path to the top. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on ThinkPod. Could I ask you to start by introducing yourself?
I am Amanda Pullinger. I'm the CEO of 100 Women in Finance, which is a global association of professionals in the broad finance industry. Don't be put off by the women in our name. We have male members. We are now in 32 locations across 5 continents. And our mission is to empower women in the finance industry at each career stage and to inspire the next generation of pre-career women to find pathways into the industry.
Okay, so is there a woman problem in finance?
I don't think there's a woman problem. I think there's a perception problem. And by that I mean, if we look at the roles that are really underrepresented in the industry, that's notably senior investment professionals and executive committee roles, the kind of where the power in the industry lies, women are still significantly underrepresented. But even in that area, those women do exist. And a lot of what I focus on is creating visibility of those women. Because if we're going to change the demographics of the industry, we have to start by changing the perception of what an expert looks like. So I think part of the issue is that women traditionally have been underrepresented, but more importantly, not visible to their colleagues, to the next generation of women. So I don't think there's a woman problem. I think there is a perception problem and a visibility issue.
But at the level we are at now, I mean, what percentage of women are in finance, certainly in senior jobs in finance?
It depends on how you categorize these things. As you know, in many parts of the world, there are these questions around what the data looks like. What we know, because we're focused on Vision 30 by 40, which is we want to see 30% of senior investment professionals be women and 30% of executive committee roles be women by 2040. So we're focused on those 2 areas, not at the exclusion of everything else, but because those are really underrepresented. So what we know is that about 10% of the world's fund managers are women today across private equity, real estate, VC, hedge funds, long-only mutual funds. Better on the long-only mutual fund side, far worse on the PE, VC side. And so 10% to 30% is a journey, even over 20 years. So we know that number. And then on the executive committee role front, the senior management area, it is better than 10% because increasingly you're including roles that are brand new roles to the industry. So we're seeing roles like head of sustainability, or ESG, or some of the more innovative
They shouldn't be
things.
seen as sort of women's roles, should they, really?
They shouldn't, but you know what? I'll take it. I'll take if it means that you're adding women to the executive committee. You're right, they shouldn't be seen as women's roles, but I want to see that the power structure, which is in the executive committee, where they have equal votes, at least become 30%. There is a way to go, but we're focused on making those changes. And I should add, that 10% has not changed for 30 years.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because certainly more broadly in corporate boards, there's a perception that actually the pipeline is drying up and that we may have reached a plateau for representation of women, which could even decline. Is it the same in finance?
I think it's completely wrong. The talent is there. I go back to what I said. The challenge is the talent is not visible. And the talent is not visible externally, So at a conference like we're at right now, the reality is, that we need more women on the main stage. There are women out there who have the talent. I can tell you, I know them, right? But it is harder to get a woman to be on a stage for lots of different reasons. And so our efforts are to make sure that every panel we put on, every initiative that we put on, that we feature not just men, but we feature women. And obviously over the last couple of years, we've been really focused on featuring women of colour as well in the industry. And I can tell you they are there. From an internal perspective, I think, again, I believe the pipeline is there internally, but we've got to change the way that we think about promoting people. So I can tell you that female fund managers, one of the myths in our industry is that if you work hard and you perform, someone will notice you. It's complete rubbish. This is a relationship business. So some of this is about persuading women who are coming to me and saying, look, I'm outperforming my male colleagues. And the numbers are there to prove it. Why am I not being given the opportunities? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that women focus on the job, focus on the performance, and aren't focused on investing in themselves and spending that time building the relationships. So one of the initiatives that we've put in place is a Global Fund Women Conference. This is about introducing institutional investors to female portfolio managers. Because of COVID, we ended up having to go virtual, and therefore we made it global. Last year, when we held the conference for the second time virtually, we introduced 350 female portfolio managers to over 400 institutional investors. And what's interesting is these are women who have a track record, who have performed, and yet institutional investors are saying, gosh, how is it possible we didn't know this talent existed? And so a lot of what we are doing as an organization is connecting those that are asking for the diverse talent with the talent itself. I don't know why those connections haven't been made in the past. All I know is that we're there to provide that connection. So I would argue there is increased level of talent. For many of those women, they both had support from a partner who was dedicated, at least not all of their career. I mean, you do see some women who've got to the top who've shared their career journey with their husband. But certainly the key is that you have a relationship where there is a mutual respect of each other's careers and an understanding that you can't both be necessarily aiming for the top at the same time. I also think, though, that for many of those women, it never really bothered them to be the only one in the room. And I talk a lot about this, that actually, as an industry, what we don't talk about is what it feels like to be the only woman in the room, the only woman in your role, or the only woman in your firm. When I was at a hedge fund, 20 years ago now, I was the only woman in my firm. It never bothered me to be the only one. But for most women in this industry, or coming into this industry, it is an issue. And I'll tell you why.
And obviously there was the harassment issue as well.
There is, but I think to me, that's less of an issue than it is about feeling that you can find your people in this industry. So if you're sitting in an office and you're constantly the only one, it's not that you don't want to work with men, right? I mean, we wouldn't be in this industry if we didn't want to work with men. But there are moments where it's just nice to talk to someone without using a sports analogy. It is nice to have those moments.
Please don't start, I don't understand.
It's just nice to have a conversation with someone who gets you. And we're all like that. We're human beings at the end of the day. And this is not all the time. But so for those women for whom it is an issue, for those women for whom there is a stigma around a working mother. And it's interesting because that stigma is not necessarily in the countries you would expect. Some of the worst stigmas around working mothers, particularly if you're highly educated, are in countries like Germany and Switzerland, where the whole social fabric is built to encourage highly educated women who have families not to work. A lot of what we're doing at 100 Women is helping women to find their people. So we have peer engagement initiatives at each career stage. So if you're an early career professional, we help you find your people, right? And those conversations, particularly when you go into your mid-career, around What does it mean to have a family? How do you balance things? How do you cope? How do you deal with being with the assumptions around, you're clearly of an age where you're going to have a child, and therefore we're not going to give you a stretch assignment. All of that, it is about changing the culture, but it's also about taking back control. And I think taking back control is about having your group of supportive women who can say, you know what, you can do this. You got this.
Obviously, there's an issue of fairness and of equity, but do women bring something different and valuable to finance, for example, that men don't?
I don't think it's about gender. I think it's about bringing different perceptions and different life experiences and a different background to the case. I think gender is part of that, because I think women do have a different experience very often of life. I think they look at the world differently. But I think it's about gender per se. I mean, one of the most interesting studies that I've read on diversity and the power of diversity was a study that Harvard Business Review did probably about 5 years ago now. They looked at 20,000 VC deals that were done, and they looked at the composition of the deal team and then looked at the success of those deals. The worst performing deals were done by individuals who all went to the same university. The best performing deals were done by those who had a team that was ethnically diverse. And I love that study because I haven't mentioned gender at all.
No.
And of course, gender's involved in that.
Has there been a study of teams?
In my mind, it is not that women are better than men. I think it's that it's coming at it from the approach that you need different voices on a team. And so obviously women should be involved. And the challenge becomes, and the reason that we're saying 30%, right, is you can't just have a token woman. Because, there are challenges in that sense. I mean, interestingly, at 100 Women, we added our first man to the board a number of years ago. And it's interesting because I challenged the board at a certain point and said, well, hold on a second. If we're saying diversity produces better results, why do we not have a man on the board? But bringing just one man onto the board, actually, it adds a little bit of diversity, but it brings in the issue that I mentioned earlier, which is that man now feels like he's the only one, and he has to be very careful what he says and all this stuff. So we now have two men on our board, and it does make a significant difference, because I think it brings a different perspective, and that's what it comes down to. This is not about women versus men, but obviously, if you're talking about demographics, women take up, women are more than 50% of the population. And so before we start talking about ethnic diversity and disability diversity and
gender
everything
diversity,
else, then we really do have to address the fact that we're not a minority in the population. And so if we can't solve for women being significantly represented, then that has to be the first step, and then all of the other types of diversity do definitely come into play.
We've talked about regional differences. The UK and the US, there's Europe as well, and obviously there's the Middle East region. Representation of women in finance, does it vary dramatically between regions?
So it's really interesting. I've been doing this for a long time now, and I've been traveling, I've traveled around the world. So I think there are two misperceptions. One is that somehow the developed world is far ahead of the developing world when it comes to gender diversity in our industry. And the second is that if I look at investment professionals, what's really interesting is, and we have a Fund Women Visibility Initiative on our website. So we feature women we have the headshots of women who are in those roles. I reckon about 80% of the world's investment professionals, senior investment professionals, come from a Chinese background. Not necessarily born in China, but ethnically Chinese. And my theory there is that, and it's the same for other former communist countries, that in many of those countries, the expectation was that men and women worked. And the expectation was that children were taken care of either by the family or by some form of outsourced resource. So in China, women always managed the money. So there's no stigma around women being in the finance world, and there's no stigma around educated women who are mothers being in the workforce. So it comes back to this cultural issue of, within a society, is there a stigma around women working? I also think, though, that there are certain countries that have been very deliberate in terms of putting in place policies, processes that encourage more representation. I'm not a quota lover myself, but in certain situations, government quotas have certainly started the process of increasing representation. I worry because I think there are unintended consequences to quotas. I actually think what the UK did in terms of board representation was quite smart, because there was a threat of quotas if the industry didn't get their act together to get men involved in the process of championing the cause for more women on boards. And the UK's got there as a result.
And finally, your ambitions, hopes for the next decade?
Well, I'm on a mission, as I told you, to get more women visible. So I'm hopeful that you'll be interviewing a lot more women in roles that are important for us to demonstrate that women are in those roles. My hope is that we grow the participation of 100 women in finance around the world. I mean, it's taken us 20 years to get to 32 locations, but there are still some other locations where those women need us, and we need them.
Anna Pullinger, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In these turbulent times, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to Thinkpod for more insight and analysis.